Welcome back to the Week 4 lecture. This week we are going to be covering an introduction to dichotomous keys, which is a type of key that you'll find in your textbook. And then we will be covering your instructions on how to do the Week 4 lab. So this week, in Week 4, aside from the Week 4 lecture, you will be collecting and pressing 2 different conifer species for lab. And I'll be going over that in the second half of this lecture, how to do that and what exactly you need to do. So you'll be collecting 2 species and pressing them this week, and then next week in lab, you'll be working on trying to use your text to key those out. Your discussion this week, you'll be doing the species research again, and then you'll have your second quiz due on Sunday by 11:59 p.m. covering the Week 3 and 4 lectures.
We briefly started covering dichotomous keys last week. Just to review, a dichotomous key starts with the word die. Die means 2, so essentially it's a key where there are 2 choices to make at each step. The beginning steps are usually general characteristics, and as you move through the key, the characteristics get more and more specific to the plant that you're working on. Your goal when following the key is to get to the name of the plant. And once you get to the name of the plant, then you stop at that point on the key and don't continue going any further. So here's a real quick non-plant example just to go through a sample dichotomous key. So at step 1, you have the choice you are younger than 18 or you are older than 18. If you are older than 18, which I'd assume most of us are, then you will go on to the number on the right. It says go on to 3, so you'll move to question number 3. And question number 3 says you are a female or you are a male. And if you're female, then your name for this key would be female adult. If you are male, your name would be male adult. So once you get to that final step where you're given that name, then at that point you can stop on the key. And this is just a really simple example just to go through those steps, and now we'll go ahead and work on a plant example going through the key next. So essentially your textbook Manual of Oregon Trees and Shrubs is just a large key to plants, and the first thing that you need to know for this book is whether your plant is a conifer or a broadleaf tree or shrub. If you're doing a conifer, you'll go to the key on page 35, and then the key to the broadleaf trees and shrubs is on page 107. First we'll go through this tree here. Hopefully you can tell by looking at this that it's a conifer. And even if you already know what this is just by looking at it, let's go ahead and work through the key here and just to get practice going through the key. The conifer key starts on page 35, so if you were working through this plant, you go ahead and go to page 35. And choice number 1 is, are the leaves scale-like, all-like, or both? And the other choice is that the leaves are not as above. They may be linear, acicular, or lanceolate. The tip on the upper right-hand corner states that usually the traits at the beginning of the question are the most important ones. As the statement goes on, it gives more details to help you in case you couldn't get that first characteristic there. But if you are able to tell from the first few words of that segment what your plant is, then you really don't need to move on. So if you have leaves or scale-like, and you can tell by the picture down there in the lower right-hand corner that the leaves are definitely scale-like, you really don't have to worry about going through the arrangement or any of the other things in the key there. So for number 1, the leaves are scale-like, and if you follow that over to the right-hand side, it says it has a number 2 there, and that means that we're going to go on to question number 2. The leaves do not fit the bottom statement, which would lead us to number 7. So we're not going to go to number 7. You'll follow the key through to question number 2. So question number 2 asks if the spray of foliage, or essentially a segment of several twigs and leaves, lies flat or does not lie flat. And if you can tell from the picture here, it looks like the leaves coming off the branch are flat. So that would mean that we're going to move on to number 5. Number 5 asks you to find 4 leaves near the end of the branchlet, and remember a scale is a leaf. So you look at that segment in the very upper right hand corner of 4 scales or 4 leaves, and it says that they're several times longer than wide. They overlap and resemble a wine goblet where they meet. The second statement there says that the set of 4 leaves are not as above, that they're about as long as they are wide. So these are clearly much longer. That segment of 4 is much longer than it is wide. Remember, you're looking at that whole segment of 4. And in the upper statement, it says the cones are about 1 inch long. When they are open, they resemble a flying goose, and when they're closed, they resemble a duck's bill. So that looks pretty much like our cones for this plant. When they're open and closed, they look like that shape, and they are longer than wide. So that's going to lead us to the genus name of Callicedrus, which is incense cedar. And once you know the genus name, it will tell you the page number to go to for the key for that genus in order to get the entire species name. So we'll go ahead and move on to page 91. Okay, and it just so happens that Callicedrus decurrens, or incense cedar, is the only species in this genus that we have in North America. So essentially we're done with the key at this point. If there were several species, there would have been another key on that page, but we now know the name Callicedrus decurrens, or common name incense cedar, and we are done keying plant number 1. So let's key through one more plant just to get you familiar with going a different pathway through the key. We'll go ahead and do a conifer again, so you'll go back to page 35 on your key, and it asks you again, are the leaves scale-like, all-like, or both, or not as above? They may be linear, acicular, or lanceolate. And just to refresh your memory from earlier week's lectures, acicular means needle-like, and these leaves are definitely needle-like. So that would lead us to the second number 1 there, which tells us to go to question number 7. Question number 7 asks if the needles are born in clusters, such as a fascicle, which is a bundle of needles, or if all the needles are born individually, so each needle is connected directly to the twig, separate from each other. And this tree here has needles that are in a fascicle or a cluster, so we're going to move on to question number 8. Question number 8 asks if the needle clusters bear 2 to 5 needles or more than 10 needles per cluster. And if you look at this needle cluster here, or fascicle, it has 3 needles coming off of it, and that's going to lead us to the genus Pinus, which is on page 48. So we'll go ahead and go to page 48 and do the key in that section. Next it asks if there are 5 needles per fascicle or 2 or 3 needles per fascicle, and this has 3 needles per fascicle. So that's going to lead us on to number 5. Number 5 asks if there are 2 needles per fascicle or 2 or 3 needles per fascicle. So this is one where if there were 2 needles per fascicle, you would want to read the rest of the statement. But since we have 3 needles per fascicle, it only fits with that second number 5. So we'll go ahead and move on to question number 6. For number 6, we've got 3 needles per fascicle, which could fit either the top or the bottom choice. So this is an example of where you need to move on to the second characteristic. And our needles are 8 inches long, which would fit in the 5 to 11 inch category best. And they are a little more blue-green colored, so that would fit the second category here best. And we'll move on to number 7. On number 7, our cones are 4 inches, this particular cone is 4 inches long, so that's in the 3 to 5 inch long category. And the scales do have straight prickles on them, meaning the prickles stick out. And when you grab the actual pine cone, it will most likely poke your fingers. So this would fit under ponderosa pine best. And just a few tips if you're out in the field and you're trying to tell the difference between a ponderosa pine and a Jeffrey pine. The ponderosa pine, like I said, it will usually feel prickly when you pick up the pine cone, and that gives it the nickname prickly ponderosa. And the Jeffrey pine cones, their prickles kind of curve in so that it has the nickname gentle Jeffrey. And also the Jeffrey pine bark has a sweet sort of vanilla or butterscotch smell, and it usually grows at higher elevations. So if you feel the cone, smell the bark, and you're not getting that kind of sweet vanilla or butterscotch smell, then it's probably and it's prickly, then you're probably ponderosa pine. Since we know that this was a ponderosa pine, we're done with our keying. We have our name, Pinus ponderosa or ponderosa pine, and that's the end of example number 2.
Okay, that's it for the week 4 lecture. So next I'm going to move on to what you'll be doing for lab this week for the week 4 lab. And the first thing that you'll need to do for the lab is collect 2 different conifer species, and then you're going to be drying them in your press. So I'll go over in the upcoming slides what exactly a conifer is and how to dry them in your slide. Now, just a tip, if you're out collecting your 2 conifer species and you can find 4, then you can get your collecting done for the week 6 lab as well, and you won't have to go collecting again until week 7. So just so you know, you don't need to know the names of the conifers this week, so you don't need to know what you're collecting except that it is a conifer. You'll be attempting to key out the conifers using your key next week. Let's cover real quick what a conifer is. And conifers are plants that for the most part have cones where the seeds are grown. So if you look at the picture here on the right, this is a type of a pine, ponderosa pine, and you can see the typical pine cone structure that you would typically think of with conifers. Now, some conifers don't produce the exact cone-like structures like the juniper trees. They have these things that we tend to call juniper berries, although they're not really berries. But these are also conifers. So conifers can have woody cones. Most of them do. This is a spruce cone. This is a pine cone here, a spruce cone here, and a Douglas fir cone here. So most of the conifers that you'll see will have the woody cones, although some will have the more fleshy cones like the junipers. Conifers also tend to have either needles or scale-like leaves. And this is a pine here. The pine, spruces, and firs have needles of various lengths. And the junipers have more of what look like these little scales all put together, these scale-like leaves. And the cedars kind of have the scale-like leaves too. And if you want a full list of the conifers, you can see a full list on page 27 and 28 in your text. And the following pages after that show you some pictures of what these conifers look like. Just for an overview, so you can get an idea of what you're looking for when you go out there, some of the main types of conifers are junipers, which will have this look from a distance and this look close up. The cedars, which have this look from a distance. They also have the scale-like leaves close up. This is what the cones of the cedar look like. The pines, which have typically longer needles, although some pines like lodgepole pines have needles that are just a couple inches long, and they have the woody cones here. Next we have the firs, and Douglas fir is not one of the true firs, but it does have the short needles like a true fir. So most of the firs have a little bit shorter needles than pines, but still you can definitely tell it's a needle and not a scale-like leaf. And then the spruces also have sort of shorter needles and woody cones. And so like I said, you don't need to know what your tree is that you collect this week. You just need to know that hopefully you're collecting a conifer so that you can key those out next week using the conifer key. Now for the week 4 lab, just a few tips on collecting plants. You need to keep your plants moist until you press them. So you can do this by taking out a plastic bag with you that has a wet paper towel in it, and then putting your sample in that plastic bag within a day or so. You don't want to leave it in the plastic bag with the paper towel too much longer, or it can start to mold. If for some reason you can't get it in your press within a day or so, hopefully, I think you all have your presses ready, but if for some reason you couldn't put it in the press, you can put your sample with your wet paper towel in the fridge and leave it there for a little bit until you get it pressed. But the main reason that we get it in the press quickly is so that it doesn't dry out or wilt. And so some plants will have leaves that are more likely to wilt. Conifers won't wilt as much, but they will dry out. And then when you go to press them, if they're dry, all the needles will fall off and you won't have a very nice looking plant left over. So for the most part, the cones are going to be too large and too hard to put in your press. So you'll be taking a picture of the cone. So I'll go over on the next slide what to take pictures of for what you'll need to exactly do for the lab. So when you collect your conifer, you're going to need some pictures for your plant collection. And this, you're going to need these pictures when you turn in your final plant collection toward the end of the class. So when you take your picture, what I want you to do is place a piece of paper with the plant number on it in front of you. So if you have someone to hold the paper for you, they can hold the paper. Otherwise, you can just set the paper. I know the number's not real easy to see, but you can set the paper next to the tree or plant that you're collecting with the number on it. The reason that we do the number is because it's easy to forget which plant goes with which collection once you start getting several different plants and moving on through the course. So this number here helps you make sure that you don't lose track of what plant you've collected. Having a picture of the plant's useful also when you go to key out your plant and you need to look back at what the overall plant looks like. And you'll be putting this picture in your final digital plant collection and presentation. So for example, the first conifer that you collect is going to be plant number 1. The second conifer you collect will be plant number 2. In case you're wondering, this plant in the picture is not a conifer, but just trying to illustrate the idea of putting the piece of paper with a number on it for your collection. And then each plant that you collect after that, you'll just number them in order 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Some parts of the key require a description of the bark and the cones. So if you could take a picture of the bark and the cone, that would be great. If possible, you can take a sample of the bark, because sometimes the samples or the bark is small enough that you can put that into your press. Like juniper bark peels off kind of nicely. Some bark may not come off very well, and that's fine if you can't get the bark off the conifer as well. And then lastly, after you've taken your pictures, you'll clip off a piece of the tree. It's handy to have some kind of scissors or clippers when you go out collecting so that you can cut that off. And then make sure that you either number your bag or tie a tag around your plant with the plant number on it. So for example, for plant 1, it would be helpful to, on your baggie, put a number 1, get like a permanent marker and write number 1 on it, or tie a tag around the plant and put number 1 on that tag. So when you go to press your plants, what you're going to do is want to have a piece of plant that will fit onto about an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. So your newspaper may be a little bit bigger than that. And if your plant's bigger, you can just trim off a piece that's about the size that will fit on a white piece of paper. If you need to have your sample be longer than that, which usually in a conifer you can just trim it, but some plants you'll want to collect a bigger piece. If you did, you can fold that plant in half. But I think for the most part, you should be able to trim your plants to the size of the paper. Then you want to make sure that your plant is arranged nicely so that the needles and leaves are lying flat. They're not lying on top of each other. The juniper is not the best example because these scale-like needles kind of go everywhere, so they do overlap just by the nature of the plant. But especially if you have a broadleaf plant with bigger leaves, you'll want to make sure those leaves are laying out nicely and not smashed on top of each other and folded over. And then, so make sure it's laid out nicely the way that you want it to look. Once you press it and dry it, then you can't rearrange your plant anymore. It will break if you try to rearrange it. So you'll place your plant between the sheet of newspaper, fold the newspaper over, put it in your press that you made in previous week, and make sure something heavy is on top of it or that you tie it up, and so that you can flatten the plant as much as possible. So the goal in your plant collection is that you have a plant that's flat and not a really thick plant. If you have a small piece of bark that you want to include in your sample, like the juniper bark is pretty thin, you can include that. If it's a really fat piece of bark, then I would not include that in your collection. Okay, so lastly, just to cover what you're going to be turning in for the week 4 lab. So you're going to take 4 pictures if possible of each conifer. You'll take a picture of the whole tree, a picture of the bark on the tree, a picture, some parts of your key, you do need to know what the bark looks like, a picture of the cone if it has cones. Now you may be out at the time when the tree does not have cones, and if that's the case, then just make a mention of that there were no cones present. And then you'll take a picture of your conifer laid out on the newspaper, so getting ready to be pressed. So you'll do that for conifer 1 and for conifer 2. And again, if it doesn't have cones, then just make a note of that when you turn in your your lab assignment that it did not have cones. Okay, so that's it for the week. Make sure that you turn in those pictures listed on the previous slide for your week 4 lab, that you get your week 4 discussion completed. You'll be researching another different species and submitting that, and then you have your second quiz due on Sunday, which covers the week 3 and week 4 lectures. So that's the end of week 4, and if you have any questions along the way, please let me know. Otherwise, I'll be in touch with you again in week 5.